Let's discuss how to design a brief experimental analysis, or BEA. First, let's talk about the basic ingredients of a BEA. These include identifying the target academic skill. Doing so requires you to implement the diagnostic skills you learned in the first module. You also need to identify the appropriate assessment measure. So if an examination of existing data suggests that oral reading fluency is the primary deficit, then the target skill is oral reading fluency, and an appropriate assessment would be the passage fluency curriculum-based measure. Second, developing reasonable hypotheses as to why that student is struggling with the target skill. These hypotheses come from reviewing a student's records and conducting assessments and observations, and considering the conceptual frameworks such as can't do, won't do, Daly's hypotheses, and the instructional hierarchy from which to generate the hypotheses. Third, selecting an intervention to match each hypothesis. If the hypothesis is lack of motivation, then the intervention would be a contingent reinforcer. If the hypothesis is that a student needs more practice, then a good option for oral reading fluency would be a repeated reading intervention. If the data suggests that the student is accurate but slow, based on the instructional hierarchy, we might hypothesize that they are at the proficiency stage and thus require lots of practice to develop fluency. Fourth, the final basic ingredient, is to determine the order in which to implement the selected intervention. Determining the order is an important step, which we'll talk about more in a subsequent slide. When selecting hypotheses and interventions, it's critical to remember that hypotheses are most effective when tied to an underlying theory of learning and behavior. We focused on can't do, won't do, sometimes called skill versus performance deficits, the instructional hierarchy, and Daly's 5 hypotheses. Interventions selected based on those frameworks should be research and evidence-based. In a BEA, it's also acceptable to combine hypotheses and to test a combined intervention package. For example, you might consider that the hypothesis is the student lacks motivation and practice, so you might generate an intervention that combines repeated readings, which is for practice, and contingent reinforcer or reward to support the motivation. And you can compare the combined intervention versus either one of those things alone. Another example is you might consider that the student lacks both practice and feedback. So you might create an intervention for oral reading fluency that has repeated readings to support practice and something called the phase drill, which is a way to provide embedded feedback. Indeed, often multiple factors explain why a student is struggling, so combining hypotheses and creating a combined intervention may be a useful and effective approach to identifying effective interventions at Tier 3. Once selected, the order of interventions in a BEA is a critical consideration to the success of the BEA. To that end, there are 3 typical sequences of a BEA. First, you can test single component interventions administered in order of increasing intensity or increasing resource needs. Second, you can do a building up approach in which intervention components are added sequentially to form a combined intervention. And third is the breaking down approach, in which a combined intervention is implemented and then followed by systematic removal of one component at a time in a predetermined order. For the first one, the reason why you begin with the least intensive intervention first is that if a less intensive intervention proves to be as beneficial as a more intensive intervention, we'd select the less intensive intervention because it's less use of resources such as instructional time. Building up approach and breaking down approach are both used when you are including a combined intervention or multi-component intervention. So now that you have the basic ingredients in place, you've identified the target skill and the appropriate assessment, you've generated hypotheses as to why the student is struggling, match those hypotheses to intervention, and consider the order in which you want to implement those interventions. It's time to implement the BEA design, which is as follows. You first assess baseline performance, Then you implement each intervention in the pre-specified order. Several experimental procedures are tested within a BEA, but no more than 2 conditions are administered per day. Then you reassess baseline performance. Then the 2 intervention conditions that led to the greatest improvement in the target scale are implemented in reversed order, and that part of the BEA is called the withdrawal reversal. So let's look at an example from the data of a BEA that was focused on the target skill of spelling. The assessment measure was spelling CBM measured using correct letter sequences. The dark, bold line separates the individual implementation and the withdrawal reversal phase. So first, we start with the baseline. They scored about 20-25. When they administered the incentive, probably for the hypothesis that the students lacked motivation, the students' score improved up to 60 correct letter sequences. They had another intervention for self-selection, probably also a different way of doing motivation. Also similar performance, slightly higher, but not significantly. Then they did a modeling intervention for the hypothesis that the student needed more modeling and needed more explicit instruction. The student's performance improved, not to the degree that it did when doing the motivation interventions. And finally, they tested a repeated writing plus feedback, a combined intervention that addressed the hypotheses of needing more practice, hence the repeated writing, and needing more feedback. The intervention was fairly successful, but not quite to the degree of the motivation conditions. So now we enter the withdrawal reversal phase. We reassess baseline performance. Now baseline has improved since the initial baseline. So some learning did occur because now performance is close to 40 correct letter sequences. So we've returned to baseline, and now we implement the 2 interventions that had the greatest success in the first round, which was incentive and self-selection, but we implement them in the reversed order. Hence, this phase is called the withdrawal, baseline, and reversal. So now we implement self-selection and then incentive to make sure it's not an order effect. And what we see is that self-selection is higher than incentive, both in the individual implementation phase and in the withdrawal reversal phase. So we would select the self-selection intervention as the intervention that will have the most chance of being effective for this student whose name is Ned. Here's another example BEA. Again, we start with baseline performance. They implemented incentive, self-selection, modeling, repeated writing plus feedback, the same interventions for the same hypotheses, but for a different student. This is for a student named Alan. And what we see is that different interventions were successful. The incentive intervention and modeling intervention were less effective than self-selection and the combined repeated writing plus feedback. So in the withdrawal phase, we withdraw all interventions, reassess baseline performance, but here we see baseline performance actually increased quite a bit, so some learning did occur. Then we take the 2 most effective interventions, which was repeated writing plus feedback and self-selection, and implement them in reversed order. So repeated writing plus feedback first, then self-selection, and we see that for Alan, repeated writing plus feedback was the most effective intervention. Perhaps because Alan's underlying skill deficit was due to the need for increased practice and increased feedback, whereas Ned's was due to needing a type of motivation. So for Alan, we would implement a Tier 3 intervention that uses repeated writing or practice plus feedback. So you might ask, what do you do if the withdrawal reversal is inconclusive? In both the previous examples, the withdrawal reversal clearly showed one of the interventions being more successful than the other. Well, if it's inconclusive, here's what you do. You conduct a third BEA session. You would reassess baseline. Then you combine the highest 2 strategies and assess the combined intervention. Then You administer the strategies alone in reverse order, again, which actually ends up being the original order because this is the third time. If the combined intervention is highest, the BEA is complete. Here's an example of what this happened, and this was for a student named Danny. Again, the BEA started by assessing baseline performance, followed by the implementation of incentive, self-selection, modeling, and repeated writing plus feedback interventions. Notice how that the most resource-intensive intervention ended up last. Incentive and self-selection are pretty minimally intensive interventions because you simply offer a contingent reinforcer or you allow a student to have some control over the instructional sequence. Modeling is certainly more intensive, and repeated writing plus feedback is more intensive still. So in the initial sequence, we see that for Danny, incentive and repeated writing plus feedback were the most effective. So in the first withdrawal reversal phase, we reassess baseline performance, but baseline increased quite a bit, and repeated writing plus feedback and incentive, when we implement them in reverse order, this time incentive seemed to be the most effective thing. So we don't have a consistent finding. We hope to find the experimental effect twice, both in the initial time and the withdrawal reversal, but here we only have it once. One time favoring repeated writing plus feedback, and the other time favoring incentive. So we need to do a new phase of the BEA in which we reassess baseline, and the baseline dropped this time. Then we combine the two highest things, which was repeated writing plus feedback plus incentive this time. And then we implement the two individual interventions, but in a reversed order from before, which actually is the original order. So incentive, repeated writing, incentive, repeated writing. And in this time, now we see that the combined intervention was the most effective. So for Danny, we would implement a combined intervention that incorporates repeated writing plus feedback, addressing the hypotheses of needing more practice and needing more feedback, and a contingent reinforcer to address the hypothesis of needing more motivation. To sum up, with the BEA, you are doing a mini scientific study. Because of that, you have to think carefully about the BEA's design, and you need to implement the BEA in a controlled scientific manner. Otherwise, conclusions from the BEA may be misleading. With respect to the design of a BEA, common designs include starting from the least intensive intervention and ending with the most intensive, building up to a combined intervention, or starting with a combined intervention and then breaking that combined intervention down into component pieces. The goal in a BEA, and this is important, is to demonstrate a functional relationship. Again, this is based on functional analysis of academic skills. So the goal in a BEA is to demonstrate a functional relationship between an intervention and the target behavior. In other words, we're trying to demonstrate a relationship that shows an improvement in the target skill associated with the implementation of the intervention. We want to demonstrate that functional relationship, but once isn't enough. We actually want to demonstrate that relationship twice within a BEA, which is called replicating the finding. Replicating the functional relationship is critically important because it shows greater evidence that the intervention is effective. Just showing an intervention having a strong effect once isn't enough to suggest that it will be consistently able to improve the performance of the student. So because we want to demonstrate and replicate the relationship twice, this is why we actually do the withdrawal reversal phase. We're trying to replicate a relationship we found in the initial phase of the BEA. This is also why when the withdrawal reversal phase is inconclusive, we do a third phase of the BEA. We're trying to find a replication, and if the replication is inconclusive, we will do a combined intervention.